The voicemail came in at 6:47 on a Tuesday morning while I was elbow deep in a spreadsheet audit that wasn't going to fix itself. My mother's voice, clipped and businesslike, the way she talked to contractors she was about to underpay. "We had a family meeting last night. We've decided you're no longer part of the business. Effective immediately. Your father and I agreed it's cleaner this way. Don't make this difficult." That was it. 43 seconds, 11 years of my life in 43 seconds and a click. I sat in my car in the parking garage of the firm where I'd spent the last 4 years building a career that had nothing to do with them, and I listened to it again. Then a third time. Not because I couldn't process it, because I wanted to make sure I understood exactly what they'd done. My brother had texted me 20 minutes earlier, just a thumbs up emoji. I hadn't known what it was for until that moment. I put the phone down on the passenger seat, opened my laptop, and I got to work. I am a CPA. I have been since I was 26. Before I got my license, before I passed my boards, before any of that, I spent 4 years managing the books for Callaway Home Services, my family's HVAC and plumbing company that my grandfather built from a single service van in 1987. I managed payroll, vendor contracts, quarterly taxes, and the line of credit that kept the whole operation breathing. I did it for a salary that was 30% below market because my mother said family businesses ran on trust, not competition. I believed her for longer than I should have. What I hadn't told them, what I had never mentioned in any of our Sunday dinners or quarterly reviews, or the times my father slapped my brother on the back and called him the future of the company, was that 6 months earlier, I had quietly begun separating myself. Not visibly, not in any way they would notice, just the slow, careful work of a person who has learned to read the room years too late. I had already moved the access credentials for the company's accounting software to a login only I controlled, not to steal anything. Every dollar was documented. But because I'd been doing forensic work long enough to know that when a family business goes sideways, the person holding the books is always the first one blamed and the last one protected. I opened the vendor portal and began composing a standard payment hold notice. 3 pending invoices totaling just over $84,000, 2 to HVAC parts suppliers, and 1 to a subcontractor my brother had brought in for a commercial job in March. I didn't cancel the contracts. I just flagged them as pending internal review, standard language, the kind a new CFO might send before approving a large outgoing payment. Then I logged into the payroll system, the one I had set up, the one I had negotiated the licensing for, the one whose admin credentials had always been mine because my mother had handed me a sticky note with a temporary password in 2019 and never asked about it again. I set the next pay cycle to pending approval, not canceled, pending, requiring my sign-off. They had removed me from the family business. They had not removed me from the systems that kept it running. I closed the laptop, picked up my coffee, and walked into the office. That afternoon, my manager stopped by my desk. "You okay? You seem quiet." "Just focused," I said. "Big quarter." I smiled, and I meant it. Let me tell you about the ledger I had been keeping in my head since I was 22. The first entry was $31,000. That was the amount I had personally guaranteed on a line of credit my father needed to expand the fleet from 3 vans to 7. The bank wouldn't extend the credit without a cosigner with verified income. I had just landed my first real accounting job. My father told me it was a formality. He told me he would handle the payments. For 8 months he did. Then business slowed and he stopped, and my credit score took a 30-point hit before I noticed the missed payments on my own report. I covered the shortfall out of my savings. He paid me back, eventually, minus about $4,000. He said he'd fronted me for things I couldn't account for. He never mentioned the guarantee again, neither did I. The second entry was smaller, but it sat differently. When my brother decided he wanted to flip houses on the side, he needed a licensed contractor to sign off on the permit applications. He wasn't licensed, my father wasn't licensed, but I knew people. I spent 3 weeks calling in favors, getting a contractor I trusted to put his name on 2 permits as a professional courtesy. My brother flipped both houses, made around $60,000 combined, and thanked me by telling my mother I had been difficult to work with lately at a Christmas dinner I wasn't present for. The third entry was the one that had changed my understanding of who I was dealing with. 3 years ago, I found a discrepancy in the books, not huge, about $22,000 spread across 18 months in a vendor account that didn't exist in any of our actual contracts. I flagged it to my mother. She told me to reclass it as a miscellaneous operating expense. When I pressed her, she told me my father had borrowed against the business account to cover some personal expenses during a slow period and that it had been repaid. When I asked for documentation, she looked at me the way she looked at the landscaper who had once suggested a different mulch. "Your family," she said, "not an auditor." I reclassified the expense. I also kept a copy of every document I had touched since that day. So when my mother left me a 43-second voicemail on a Tuesday morning to let me know I was out, she did not understand what she was actually setting in motion. The call started that evening, my mother first, calm and transactional, explaining that the family had discussed it and felt the business needed to move in a new direction. My father, 20 minutes later, warmer but firm, he said he hoped I understood that it wasn't personal, that these things happened in family businesses. My brother didn't call. He texted a single line, "This is better for everyone." I didn't respond to any of them. What I did do was call my own attorney, not a family law attorney, a business attorney named Miss Tate, who I had been consulting informally for about 4 months. I told her what had happened. She told me to gather everything and come in the next morning. That night, I printed and scanned every document I had retained from 4 years of managing the company's finances: tax filings, payroll records, vendor contracts, the $22,000 reclassification memo with my mother's handwritten notation on the margin in blue ink, the email chain where my father had asked me to backdate an invoice by 3 weeks to help it fall in the previous fiscal year. I also printed the co-sign agreement from 2017, the original, the one with my signature and the bank stamp and the repayment schedule that my father had stopped following after month 8. I put everything in a binder and drove to FedEx and made 2 copies, one for Miss Tate, one I left in my car. The originals I mailed to myself at a P.O. box I had opened 6 months earlier. I went home. I made dinner. I watched television. I slept better than I had in months. The first crack appeared 4 days later. The HVAC supplier called the main office asking about the payment hold on their invoice. My mother called me. Her voice was different this time, still controlled, but underneath it, something uncertain. "There seems to be an issue with vendor payments. Can you log in and clear the holds?" "I'm no longer part of the business," I said. "Effective immediately," you said. A pause. "This is a billing matter. It's separate." "I don't think it is," I said. "But if you'd like to discuss it formally, you can have your attorney contact mine." I gave her Miss Tate's number. She didn't call back that day. The payroll cycle triggered 48 hours later. 11 employees, 2 of them my brother's friends he brought on as crew leads, didn't receive their direct deposits. My mother called me 3 times before noon. My father called twice. My brother finally called for the first time since the thumbs up emoji. "This is illegal," he said. "You can't hold people's paychecks." "I haven't done anything," I said, and that was technically true. I had set the cycle to pending. I had not touched a single dollar. The system requires an authorized administrator to approve the cycle. I'm the authorized administrator. I'm no longer part of the business. That's an access control issue, not a payroll issue. You should probably call your payroll software vendor. You set this up. I did, 4 years ago. Your mother handed me a sticky note. He hung up. The software vendor, when my mother called them, confirmed that the admin login would need to be transferred, but that the process required verification documentation and took 3 to 5 business days. Standard procedure. That was on a Thursday. Payday had been Wednesday. The thing about working in accounting is that you understand, at a molecular level, how dependent every operation is on the invisible infrastructure that keeps it moving. Most business owners never think about it. They think about the product, the customers, the revenue. The back-end systems are just there, humming along until one day they aren't. My family had never thought about it either. Why would they? I had always been there, humming along, keeping the lights on while they ran the company and took the credit and made the decisions and held the meetings I wasn't invited to. I wasn't angry anymore. I want to be clear about that. I'd been angry for years, quietly, the way you're angry when you've accepted something unfair as the price of belonging. But by the time that voicemail came in, I had already grieved the version of my family I had wanted them to be. What I felt now was something more like clarity. Ms. Tate filed a formal demand letter that Friday outlining 3 separate claims: unpaid compensation for work performed outside my employment classification, breach of the oral cosign agreement from 2017, and a request for an independent audit of the $22,000 reclassification given my potential liability as the preparer of record on the associated tax filings. The last one was the one that landed. My mother called Ms. Tate's office within 2 hours of receiving the letter. My father called twice. My brother sent me a text that said, "What are you doing?" with no punctuation, which told me he had just been told what was actually at stake. If an independent auditor reviewed those books and found what I had found 3 years ago, the reclassification didn't just become a business problem, it potentially became a tax problem, and a tax problem with the IRS. When you've been filing as an S-corp and the numbers don't line up, is not something you solve with a phone call. I hadn't filed anything with the IRS. I hadn't threatened to. Ms. Tate's letter simply noted that as the preparer of record, I had an independent professional obligation to ensure accuracy and that any discrepancies identified during an audit would need to be addressed. That was it. That was all it said. But my parents heard what they heard. 2 weeks after the voicemail, I got a call from my uncle, my father's older brother, the only person in the family who had ever spoken to me like I was a full human being. He asked if we could meet for coffee. I said yes. He looked tired. He set his cup down and looked at me across the table and said, "They didn't know what they were doing." "Yes, they did," I said, not unkindly. "They just didn't know I knew." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Your grandfather wants to see you." I hadn't spoken to my grandfather in 4 months, not since a family dinner where my father had announced in front of everyone that my brother would be taking on a more senior operational role, with a title that was functionally the role I had been doing without the title or the compensation. My grandfather had looked at me across the table that night with an expression I hadn't been able to read. I understood it now. I went to see him the following Sunday. He was 81 and moved more slowly than the last time I'd seen him, but his eyes were the same, precise, observant, the kind of eyes that had built a business from a single service van and a phone number listed in the yellow pages. He didn't talk about the family business. He talked about the company he had actually built. Callaway Home Services, the original entity, still technically existed as a holding company. My father had restructured years ago, spinning off the operating company into a separate LLC, while my grandfather still held a minority stake in the original parent entity, which included the commercial property the main warehouse sat on. My grandfather had never sold that property. He had just stopped talking about it. He told me he'd been working with an estate attorney for the past year. He told me that he had thought carefully about who in the family understood the difference between building something and extracting from it. He told me that he was tired and that he wanted things settled while he could still settle them himself. I didn't say anything for a long time. "You don't have to do anything for me," I finally said. "I know," he said. "That's why." My father called me 3 weeks later. His voice had lost the certainty it usually carried. He asked if we could talk, just the two of us, without attorneys. I said I was willing to listen. He told me the vendor holds had created a cascading problem with a commercial contract, a property management company that had given Callaway a 6-location service agreement, the biggest single contract they'd ever landed, and which was now at risk because 2 scheduled maintenance visits had been missed while the internal payment dispute had stalled parts orders. He told me the payroll issue had cost them 1 crew lead who had found another job rather than wait for the system transfer to clear. He told me the business was not in a position to absorb a prolonged legal dispute. He asked me what it would take. I had thought about this moment, not to punish him, not to extract anything beyond what was legitimate. I had made a list the same way I made any other financial list, factual, documented, without emotional inflation. That compensation for 4 years at market rate for my role, adjusted for the benefits differential between what I had received and what a non-family employee would have received. repayment of the $4,000 shortfall from the 2017 co-sign agreement with interest at the applicable federal rate, and a signed acknowledgement from both my parents and my brother that the $22,000 reclassification had been directed by management and that I, as the preparer, had flagged the issue and been instructed to proceed, a document that would protect my professional license if the matter ever came up in an audit context. No punitive damages, no public statements, no drama. My father was quiet for almost a full minute. "That's it," he said. "That's everything," I said. The acknowledgement was the one he pushed back on. He said it made them look like they had done something wrong. I told him that was because they had, and that the document wasn't for public consumption. It was for my files and, if necessary, my licensing board. He consulted with their attorney. Their attorney, I imagine, explained the alternative. He signed it 10 days later. My grandfather passed away 4 months after that Sunday visit. He had updated his estate documents the previous year. The commercial property, a 14,000 square foot warehouse on 2 acres that had been appraised at $1.1 million, passed directly to me as a named beneficiary, bypassing the family LLC entirely. There was also a letter. He had written it by hand in the careful cursive of someone who had grown up before keyboards, and Miss Tate gave it to me in her office with no preamble. "You reminded me of myself when I was young," he wrote, "not because you're like me, but because you understood that work is not the same thing as belonging, and that the people who confuse the two will always ask more than they give. I should have protected you better when I could. This is the closest I can come to it now." I read it twice. I folded it and put it in my bag. I did not cry in Miss Tate's office, which I counted as a professional achievement. My father called the day after the estate was settled. He didn't say anything about the property at first. He asked how I was doing. I told him I was well. He said he hoped we could have a normal relationship going forward. I told him I was open to that in time. What I didn't tell him was that I had already spoken with a commercial real estate attorney about the warehouse lease. The operating LLC, which was my family's business, leased the warehouse from the holding company that my grandfather had controlled. That lease had renewed annually on a handshake basis for the last decade. Now I controlled the holding company, which meant I controlled the lease. I didn't raise the rent. I didn't threaten anything. I simply had my attorney send a standard notice that the lease would need to be formalized in writing, at market rate, going forward, as part of normal estate administration. The market rate was about 40% higher than what they had been paying. They had 60 days to review and respond. My brother called me 2 days after the lease notice went out, not to negotiate, just to say in a voice that sounded genuinely confused, "I don't understand how this happened." I thought about that for a second. "You sent me a thumbs up emoji," I said, "on a Tuesday morning. That's how." He didn't have anything to say to that. Honestly, neither did I. There was nothing left to explain. The facts were the facts. I had done the work. I had kept the records. I had been patient for longer than was reasonable. And then, when the door closed, I had simply stopped pretending it hadn't. The warehouse is mine now. I've been approached by 2 logistics companies interested in the space. I'm in no hurry. The lease to the family business is month to month while we finalize the formal agreement, which means I have time to think about what I actually want. What I want, I've realized, is not complicated. I want my work to mean something that can't be taken back. I want to be in rooms where my name is in the documents, not just in other people's memories of what I did for them. I want to stop being the person who holds things together for people who would let them fall apart the moment it cost them something. My grandfather built a business from 1 van and a phone listing. He drove that van himself for the first 3 years. He told me once that the hardest thing about building something is that everyone wants to be part of it after the hard part is over. I think about that when I pull into the parking lot of the warehouse and unlock the side door and walk through the space that smells like motor oil and old concrete, and 40 years of someone else's work ethic. I think about what it means to inherit something, not because you were next in line, but because someone looked at you clearly, without the interference of ego or expectation, and decided you were the right person to carry it forward. I'm still figuring out what carrying it forward looks like. But for the first time in my adult life, that question belongs entirely to me. I still think about the sticky note sometimes. A temporary password written in my mother's handwriting, handed to me in 2019 like it was a minor errand. She never asked about it again. That's the thing about people who take without tracking. They assume the infrastructure just exists, the way they assume the lights will come on when they flip the switch. They never think about who pays the bill. What happened to me wasn't unusual. Families do this to capable people all the time. They find someone willing, someone who shows up, someone who finds satisfaction in doing things well, and they build their comfort on top of that person's consistency. It works until it doesn't. And the moment it stops working for them, the moment the capable person has needs that cost something, or questions that require answers, or just a Tuesday morning where they didn't perform gratitude convincingly enough, the family reframes the whole history. Suddenly, the person who held everything together becomes the problem, the difficult one, the ungrateful one. I was their bookkeeper, their loan guarantor, their problem solver, and their scapegoat, sometimes all in the same quarter. And for years, I accepted that arrangement because I had confused belonging with earning. I thought if I was useful enough, consistent enough, indispensable enough, eventually it would translate into something that felt like being valued. It doesn't work that way. People who see you as a resource don't promote you to family. They just find ways to need more. While I did, the careful documentation, the retained copies, the attorney consultations I had started 6 months before that voicemail ever came in, that wasn't revenge. It was integrity catching up to reality. I had spent years being honest in my professional work while quietly absorbing dishonesty at home. At some point, those two things can't coexist. You either let the dishonesty corrupt how you work, or you apply the same standards everywhere. I chose the second one, and that choice, more than anything else, is what protected me. My grandfather understood something that my father never did, that the person worth trusting is the one who does the right thing when no one is watching, not the one who performs loyalty in public while cutting corners in private. He watched me for years. He didn't say much about it. He just updated his estate documents and made sure I had something that couldn't be argued away in a phone call. I think about Colin sending that thumbs up emoji. I think about what it must feel like to be him now, to have signed off on something so casually, so confidently, and to have had no idea what was already in motion. I don't feel satisfaction about that exactly. But I don't feel sorry either. He made a choice with incomplete information because he never bothered to learn the full picture. That's not bad luck. That's the cost of operating on assumption rather than attention. The warehouse is mine. The lease is formal now, at market rate, with a 5-year term and a clause about maintenance responsibilities that my attorney drafted carefully. The family business is still operating. I didn't try to destroy it. I just stopped subsidizing it at my own expense. If you are somewhere in the middle of this, still showing up, still absorbing, still telling yourself it will eventually balance out, I want you to understand something I had to learn the hard way. Keeping records is not betrayal. Knowing your rights is not aggression, and the moment someone tells you you're out, they have answered every question you were still asking yourself about whether you owed them more. You don't, and you never did.